He thought I would cry, thought I would plead for his approval when he called me useless in front of everyone. Instead, I showed him exactly how useless I could be when I stopped caring, stopped trying, stopped being his foundation. And when his perfect life began to crumble, there was no one there to hold it together. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra. Special for you. The crystal chandelier cast a warm glow over the private dining room of the Ivory Room, the restaurant where Daniel had proposed to me 6 years ago. Tonight was supposed to be special, our anniversary celebration with his executive team. I had spent hours getting ready, choosing a dress that made me feel confident, elegant. The emerald green silk that Daniel had once said brought out my eyes, though lately he barely seemed to notice what I wore. I excused myself from the table to use the restroom, my heels clicking against the marble floor as I walked down the hallway. I paused when I heard my name. The door to the dining room was slightly ajar, and Daniel's voice carried clearly through the gap. "Honestly, Rebecca's pretty much useless when it comes to anything important," he said, followed by a casual laugh that cut through me like glass. "She looks nice on my arm at events, keeps the house tidy, but let's be real, she doesn't actually contribute anything meaningful." A chorus of chuckles followed. I stood frozen, my glass of water trembling in my hand, ice cubes clinking softly against the crystal. 6 years of marriage, of supporting his career, of running our household, of being the one who remembered his mother's birthday and his medication, and the name of every single person he needed to impress, reduced to useless. I basically let her playhouse, Daniel continued, unaware I was just steps away. It keeps her occupied, but between us, if she disappeared tomorrow, nothing in my life would actually change. More laughter, more agreement. The COO's wife even chimed in with, "At least she knows how to dress the part." Then his boss added, "Lucky for you she hasn't figured out what she's worth yet, or you'd be paying a lot more in alimony." The room erupted in laughter again. My stomach knotted as I thought about the career I'd abandoned when Daniel's first big promotion required us to relocate. The master's degree I'd put on hold indefinitely. The 1,000 small sacrifices that had become so normal I barely remembered making them. Something inside me shifted in that moment. Not the way Daniel might have expected if he knew I'd hurt him. I didn't feel tears welling up. I didn't feel the urge to burst into the room and make a scene. The Rebecca who had walked into that restaurant an hour ago would have done exactly that, created a dramatic exit, cried all night, then spent weeks trying to prove her worth. Instead, I felt a strange sort of clarity washing over me, like fog lifting from a landscape I hadn't truly seen before. 6 years of fog, lifting all at once. I straightened my shoulders, dabbed at the corner of my eye where a single tear had threatened to fall, and took 3 deep breaths. Then I walked back into the dining room with a smile that didn't quite reach my eyes. Daniel glanced up, his perfect teeth flashing in a grin that I once found charming but now saw differently. Practiced, performative, plastic. "Everything okay, babe?" he asked, pulling out my chair. A performance of consideration. That didn't extend to his actual thoughts about me. I nodded, taking my seat. "Everything's perfect," I replied, my voice steady. And in a way, it was. Perfect clarity. Perfect understanding. The perfect beginning of the end. The conversation continued around me. Market projections, quarterly goals, summer homes in the Hamptons. I smiled at all the right moments, laughed at all the appropriate jokes, all while studying Daniel from this new perspective. How had I never noticed how he subtly took credit for my ideas? How he interrupted me but nodded appreciatively when the same thoughts came from his male colleagues. How the other wives looked at me with a mix of pity and relief that it wasn't them being so casually dismissed. By dessert, my mind was made up. Not for revenge, not for a dramatic exit. Something far more powerful. I would show Daniel exactly how useless I really was, by systematically removing every single thing I contributed to his life. And I would do it so subtly, so carefully, that he wouldn't realize what was happening until his perfect world was already crumbling beneath his feet. The drive home was quiet. Daniel loosened his tie, satisfied with the evening, completely unaware of the shift that had occurred. He turned up the radio, humming along to some pop song about eternal love while I stared out the window, mentally cataloging all the ways I kept his life running. His calendar, which I managed because he couldn't be bothered with details. His networking, which I facilitated through dinner parties and social connections. His household, which ran seamlessly only because I anticipated every need. His image, which I carefully crafted through everything from his wardrobe to his charitable contributions. When we arrived home, he tossed his keys onto the marble counter and stretched, his wedding ring catching the light as he ran his fingers through his carefully styled hair. "That went well, didn't it?" he said, already walking toward the bedroom. "Collins was impressed. I think that promotion is locked in." I nodded, smiling that same empty smile. "You were very impressive." He didn't notice the subtle change in my tone, didn't register the past tense. Daniel had spent years seeing only what he wanted to see, hearing only what benefited him. That, I realized, would be his downfall. As he fell asleep that night, I lay awake beside him, listening to his even breathing, feeling nothing but a cool detachment where love had once lived. I mapped out in my mind all the invisible threads that I maintained in his life, the appointments he never had to think about, the relationships I nurtured on his behalf, the 1,000 little things that made his success possible. All the things he was about to lose one by one. I didn't need a dramatic confrontation. I didn't need to make him understand. Understanding would come on its own, in time, as his perfect life began to unravel thread by thread. Tomorrow would be day one of Daniel's new reality, and he had no idea what was coming. The next morning, I woke before the alarm as usual. For 6 years, I'd risen at 5:30 a.m. to ensure Daniel's day started perfectly. Fresh coffee brewing, his favorite shirt pressed, breakfast waiting, his briefcase packed with everything he'd need. A seamless routine that he had come to expect without acknowledgement. Today, I silenced the alarm before it could ring and lay still, watching early dawn light filter through the curtains. Beside me, Daniel slept on, oblivious to the shift occurring in his world. At 6:45, 15 minutes later than usual, his phone alarm blared. He jolted awake, confusion clouding his face as he reached blindly to silence it. "Beck," he mumbled, patting the empty space beside me. I was already in the bathroom, taking my time with my morning routine. When I emerged, he was sitting on the edge of the bed, hair mussed, looking disoriented. "Did the power go out? Why didn't the coffee maker start?" I shrugged, selecting earrings from my jewelry box. "I didn't set it." He frowned, processing this deviation from our norm. "Are you feeling okay?" "I'm fine," I said, my voice neutral. "Just didn't feel like making coffee this morning." His brow furrowed deeper, but he didn't press. This was the beauty of my plan. Small changes, nothing worth confronting, nothing that screamed rebellion. Just tiny threads being carefully, deliberately pulled from the fabric of his comfortable existence. "I'll grab something on the way to work," he muttered, heading for the shower. When he emerged 20 minutes later, he discovered his blue Oxford shirt, the one he always wore for Tuesday meetings with the board, wasn't ironed. "Rebecca, where's my blue shirt? The pressed one?" I was applying mascara in the bathroom mirror, taking unusual care with my appearance. "In the closet, I think." "It's not pressed." I met his eyes in the mirror. "I didn't get to it yesterday." Flash of irritation crossed his face. "I need it for the board meeting, you know that." "There's the steamer in the closet," I replied, returning my attention to my makeup. He stood there for a moment, hovering between disbelief and irritation, before reluctantly retrieving the steamer himself. I listened to him fumbling with it, swearing under his breath when he couldn't figure out how to fill the water reservoir. This was something I'd always done for him: pressed his shirts, selected his ties, ensured he looked the part of the successful executive. Now he was facing the reality that these things didn't simply happen by magic. Downstairs, another minor disruption awaited. No breakfast, no packed lunch, no perfectly organized briefcase. I watched as he frantically searched for the Henderson file, which would normally be waiting for him, positioned prominently on top of his other materials. "Where's the Henderson file? I told you I needed it today." His voice had an edge now, puzzlement giving way to frustration. "You didn't give it to me," I said simply, sipping the tea I'd made for myself. "Yes, I did. I left it on the counter last night." I glanced at the counter, which was now clear except for his carelessly tossed keys. "I didn't see it. It was right here." His voice rose slightly. "I left it in the car." Daniel ran his hand through his hair, a gesture I recognized as mounting stress. He wasn't used to things not being handled for him, problems not being solved before they became problems. "I don't have time for this," he muttered, grabbing his briefcase and keys. "I'm going to be late." As he rushed out the door, his tie slightly crooked, his expression harried, I felt no satisfaction, no vindictive pleasure. This wasn't about revenge. It was about reality. His reality, without the invisible support system he'd taken for granted. With the house to myself, I opened my laptop and did something I hadn't done in years: updated my resume. The marketing degree I'd earned before, meeting Daniel, the 3 years of experience at a top firm that I'd abandoned when his career required us to move. Skills that had been redirected to managing his life rather than building my own. By noon, I had submitted applications to 5 positions and scheduled lunch with Meredith, an old colleague who had remained in the industry. These weren't impulsive actions born from hurt feelings. They were calculated steps toward reclaiming my independence. Daniel called at 12:30, his voice tight with barely contained frustration. "Did you confirm my lunch with Peterson today?" Was halfway through organizing my personal files, sorting through papers that had been neglected for years. "No," I replied calmly. "You didn't ask me to." "I shouldn't have to ask. You always—" He caught himself, exhaling sharply. "The lunch has been on my calendar for weeks." "Oh," I said, offering nothing more. The silence stretched between us, heavy with unspoken tension. Finally, he spoke again, his voice forcibly controlled. "Can you call him now and confirm?" I glanced at my watch. "I'm actually heading out the door for my own lunch. Perhaps your assistant can handle it?" Another silence, this one stunned. I had never prioritized my plans over his needs, never suggested that his work obligations weren't automatically my responsibility. "Your lunch," he repeated flatly. "With who?" "Meredith Thompson. From Axiom Marketing. The job you had before we got married? You still talk to those people?" The genuine surprise in his voice was telling. Daniel had never considered that I maintained connections separate from him, relationships that existed outside the sphere of his influence. In his mind, I existed purely in relation to him. "Yes, I do," I said simply. "I'll see you tonight." Before he could respond, I ended the call and slipped my phone into my purse. 6 years ago, I would have canceled my plans immediately, scrambled to fix his scheduling oversight, probably called the restaurant myself to ensure his favorite table was ready. The old Rebecca would have prioritized his lunch meeting over her own existence. But that Rebecca was gone. At the upscale bistro downtown, Meredith greeted me with a warm hug and appraising eyes. "You look different," she said as we settled into our seats. "Good different." I smiled, a genuine one this time. "I feel different." Over salads and sparkling water, We caught up on 6 years of diverging paths. Her promotion to creative director, her marriage to a professor who encouraged her career ambitions. I carefully edited my own narrative, focusing on my desire to return to the industry rather than the collapse of my marriage. Seriously, Rebecca, you were the most talented strategist on our team, Meredith said, leaning forward. The industry has changed, obviously, but with some updating of your skills, there's definitely a place for you. For the first time in years, I felt a flicker of possibility that had nothing to do with being Daniel's wife. My phone buzzed repeatedly during lunch, Daniel calling again and again. I silenced it without looking, giving Meredith my full attention instead. By the time I returned home, it was after 4. Daniel had left 3 voicemails and 7 text messages, each one progressively more demanding. His lunch meeting had apparently gone poorly. Peterson had been kept waiting, the reservation nearly lost, and Daniel had been unprepared without the file I normally would have ensured he had. I listened to his messages with detached interest, noting the escalation from irritation to outright anger. The final one, left just 30 minutes ago, was particularly telling. Rebecca, I don't know what game you're playing, but it stops now. I had to reschedule the entire Peterson meeting because you couldn't be bothered to do the one thing I asked. We'll discuss this when I get home. I deleted the messages, slipped my phone into my pocket, and continued organizing my personal documents. There would be no tearful apologies, no scrambling to make amends. The woman who would have done those things no longer existed. Daniel arrived home at 7:30, the front door closing with more force than necessary. I was sitting in the living room, reading a book on digital marketing strategies that Meredith had recommended. No dinner waited in the oven, no wine was poured, and ready. The house was quiet, still, unchanged since morning. He stood in the doorway, tie loosened, jacket draped over his arm, surveying the scene with narrowed eyes. I could read the calculations happening behind them, trying to determine if I was ill, angry, or making some kind of statement. "Rough day?" I asked mildly, not looking up from my book. He dropped his briefcase with a thud. You could say that. Peterson was kept waiting for 15 minutes because the reservation wasn't confirmed. Then he asked about the proposal revisions that I was supposed to bring, the ones in the file you couldn't find this morning. I turned a page. That sounds frustrating. His jaw tightened at my lack of apology. What's going on with you? I finally looked up, my expression neutral. Nothing's going on with me. I'm reading. You know what I mean, Rebecca. The coffee, the shirt, the file, the lunch reservation. It's like you're deliberately trying to undermine me. I closed my book, placing it carefully on the side table. I'm not trying to undermine you, Daniel. I'm just not managing your life anymore. The bluntness of my statement seemed to catch him off guard. He'd expected denials, perhaps tears, maybe a confrontation about what I'd overheard at the restaurant. This calm declaration was outside his playbook. What are you talking about? You're my wife. We're partners. Are we? I asked, my voice level. Partners share burdens equally. They respect each other's contributions. They don't call each other useless to their colleagues. There it was, the moment of realization. His face flushed, then paled. You heard that? At the restaurant? I did. He sank into the chair across from me, running a hand through his hair. A gesture I once found endearing but now recognized as calculated, practiced. Daniel was never more charming than when caught in a lie. Babe, you know I didn't mean that. It was just guy talk, stupid bravado. I was trying to impress Collins. By belittling me? He leaned forward, voice softening to the tone he used for difficult clients. It was thoughtless, I admit that. But you're blowing it way out of proportion. One stupid comment doesn't erase 6 years of marriage. It wasn't the comment, Daniel. It was the truth behind it. I met his gaze steadily. You do think I'm useless. You've thought it for years. The only difference is now I know it too. He reached for my hand, which I carefully moved away. That's ridiculous. I couldn't function without you. Today suggests otherwise. You functioned. Not well, perhaps, but you managed. His expression hardened slightly. So this is punishment? Making my day difficult because your feelings got hurt? No, Daniel. This is reality. I'm no longer investing my time and energy into someone who sees no value in either. He stood abruptly, pacing their living room. This is insane. You're throwing a tantrum because of one offhand comment. Is that what you think this is? What else would it be? Look, I'm sorry, okay? I shouldn't have said that. It was stupid and thoughtless. But this... He gestured around the quiet house, the absence of his usual comforts. This is an overreaction. I smiled faintly. You're entitled to your opinion. Damn it, Rebecca. Just tell me what you want. An apology? Fine, I'm sorry. Flowers? I'll order them right now. What will it take to end this childish game? The old Rebecca would have accepted his non-apology, would have been so grateful for any acknowledgement that she would have rushed to make everything right again. The new Rebecca simply picked up her book. I'm not playing a game, Daniel, and I'm not asking for anything. He stared at me, bewildered by this unfamiliar terrain. The script had always been so predictable. He would do something thoughtless, I would be hurt, he would offer the minimum required to smooth things over, and I would eagerly accept, grateful, for the crumbs of his attention. Now the script had changed, and he had no idea what his lines were supposed to be. I'm going to order some dinner, he finally said, pulling out his phone. Do you want anything? No, thank you. I already ate. Another small declaration of independence. Another thread pulled from the fabric. That night, we moved around each other, like strangers sharing temporary accommodations. Daniel made several attempts at normal conversation, each one falling flat against my polite but distant responses. By the time we went to bed, his confusion had morphed into a simmering frustration that he couldn't quite articulate. In the darkness, he reached for me as he often did when he wanted to smooth over a disagreement without actually resolving it. Sex had always been his way of reclaiming control, of reassuring himself that whatever the issue, I was still his. I gently moved his hand away. Not tonight, Daniel. I felt rather than saw his surprise. This was unprecedented territory. Are you serious right now? His voice in the darkness held a note of disbelief. Completely. He turned away with a huff, the mattress shifting with his movement. Fine, whatever. I lay awake long after his breathing, had evened into sleep, feeling neither victory nor sorrow, only a strange, weightless clarity. For the first time in years, I was making choices based solely on what I wanted, not on what would please Daniel, or maintain the peace, or fulfill the role I'd been assigned in his life. The next morning, established. Our new pattern. I no longer anticipated his needs, no longer arranged my day around his schedule. I made coffee for myself, dressed for my own appointments, and left the house before he had fully processed that his shirts weren't ironed, his breakfast wasn't made, and his day wasn't meticulously planned by someone else. I spent the morning at a coffee shop downtown, refining my resume and researching industry developments I'd missed during my years away. When Daniel called at 11:30, I let it go to voicemail. Rebecca, where are you? Vivian called about the dinner party on Saturday. I told her you'd call her back to sort out the details. Also, I need you to pick up my suit from the dry cleaner for the Wilson event tomorrow night. I deleted the message without responding. The dinner party he referred to was one I had organized at his request. A carefully orchestrated evening designed to impress his new potential clients. The Wilson event was a charity gala where I was expected to play my usual role, the elegant, supportive wife who remembered everyone's names, smoothed awkward conversational lulls, and ensured Daniel was always presented in the best possible light. Neither of these obligations existed for me anymore. By day 3, Daniel's confusion had hardened into resentment. He cornered me in the kitchen that evening, his patience visibly fraying. Enough is enough, Rebecca. This has gone on long enough. Vivian called again about Saturday, and I looked like an idiot because I had no idea what was happening with our own dinner party. And my gray suit wasn't ready for the Wilson Gala, so I had to wear the navy one that doesn't fit right anymore. I continued preparing my tea. I'm sorry you were embarrassed. That's it? You're sorry I was embarrassed? How about an explanation for why you're deliberately sabotaging events that are important to my career? I turned to face him, teacup in hand. I'm not sabotaging anything, Daniel. I'm simply no longer managing your social calendar or running your errands. That's what a wife does. The words burst out of him, revealing the entitlement that had always lurked beneath his smooth exterior. No, Daniel. That's what your wife did. Past tense. The color drained from his face. What are you saying? Are you leaving me? I considered the question, taking a sip of my tea. I haven't decided yet, but I'm definitely leaving the role I've been playing. A week into my quiet revolution, I received a call from Meredith that changed everything. How soon could you come in for an interview? She asked without preamble. I showed your resume to our VP and she's intrigued. We have a strategic consultant position opening up next month, and she thinks you'd be perfect. Standing in my kitchen, Daniel's kitchen really, designed to his specifications with little input from me, I felt a surge of something I hadn't experienced in years. Professional validation. Someone valued my skills, my experience, my mind. I could come in tomorrow, I replied, already mentally reviewing my wardrobe for something appropriate. Not the careful, conservative outfits I wore as Daniel's wife, but something that reflected the professional I used to be and was becoming again. Perfect. 10 a.m. work for you? Meredith sounded genuinely excited. Fair warning, Catherine is tough, but I think you two will actually hit it off. After we hung up, I stood motionless in the kitchen, a strange lightness spreading through me. For 6 years, my days had revolved around Daniel's schedule, Daniel's needs, Daniel's career. Tomorrow, for the first time in so long, I would be walking into a room where no one cared about my husband, where I would be evaluated solely on my own merits. I spent the evening preparing, reviewing industry trends, practicing answers to potential interview questions. When Daniel arrived home, later than usual and visibly stressed, he found me surrounded by marketing journals and my laptop, completely absorbed in my research. "What's all this?" he asked, loosening his tie with jerky movements that betrayed his frustration. I glanced up briefly. "Work preparation." His brow furrowed. "Work? What work?" "I have an interview tomorrow at Meridian Strategic. They have a consultant. Position opening." He stared at me as if I'd started speaking a foreign language. "A job interview? You're looking for a job now? In the middle of whatever this is?" He gestured vaguely around the house, at the unwashed dishes in the sink, the unfolded laundry visible through the utility room door. "Yes," I replied simply, returning to my notes. Daniel pulled out a chair, sitting heavily across from me. "Rebecca, this has gone far enough. I understand you're upset about what you heard. I've apologized. But this, getting a job just to prove, some point it's extreme." I looked up, meeting his gaze directly. "I'm not getting a job to prove a point, Daniel. I'm getting a job because I want one, because I'm good at what I do, because I have value beyond being your wife." He leaned forward, his voice taking on that cajoling tone he used when trying to close difficult deals. "Of course you have value. I never said you didn't. But we agreed when we got married that my career would be the priority. My income is more than enough for both of us." "You agreed," I corrected him. "You decided. And I went along with it because that's what I thought a good wife did." "And now suddenly you don't want to be a good wife anymore?" There was an edge to his question, a hint of the anger simmering beneath. "I don't want to be an invisible wife anymore," I replied. I don't want to be the person whose contributions are so overlooked that she could be called useless and have everyone laugh in agreement. He exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. It was one stupid comment, Rebecca. One moment of idiocy. Are you really going to throw away our whole life together over that? I considered his question carefully. I'm not throwing anything away, Daniel. I'm building something new. While everything we've built together falls apart, he said bitterly. The house is a mess. The Wilson Gala was a disaster. Everyone asked where you were. Colin's wife keeps calling about the charity committee you promised to chair. Everything is falling apart, and you're sitting here preparing for a job interview like none of it matters. In that moment, I saw our marriage through his eyes. A carefully constructed system where I existed to make his life easier, to maintain his home, to enhance his social standing. My absence from that system wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a fundamental threat to his entire way of life. It matters, I said softly. It all matters, but so do I. He stood abruptly, pushing his chair back with more force than necessary. I have a presentation tomorrow that could determine whether I get the VP position. I need the Peterson file updated with the latest projections, the ones from this afternoon's meeting. It was a test, a deliberate return to our old pattern where he would state a need and I would fulfill it, no matter what else I had planned. I'm sure your assistant can help with that, I replied, closing my laptop. I need to prepare for my interview. The look on his face, shock mingled with dawning comprehension, told me everything. He had truly believed this was temporary, a brief rebellion that would dissolve the moment he reasserted the old dynamics. The realization that I was serious, that this change might be permanent, seemed to finally sink in. So, that's it? He asked, voice tight with controlled anger. 6 years of marriage? And you're just checking out because your feelings got hurt? I stood, gathering my materials. I'm not checking out of our marriage, Daniel. I'm checking back into my life. There's a difference. I walked past him, heading upstairs to continue my preparation in the small home office that had, until now, been used primarily for managing our social calendar and tracking household expenses. Tomorrow would be a turning point, and I needed to be ready. The next morning, I dressed with care in a sleek charcoal pantsuit I'd purchased years ago for an interview I ultimately canceled when Daniel's promotion required us to relocate. It still fit, though it hung differently on my frame, a physical reminder of how much had changed in 6 years. Daniel watched silently from the bed as I applied makeup, styled my hair, transformed myself from his supportive wife into someone entirely separate from him. You're really doing this, he said finally, the words somewhere between a question and an accusation. I met his eyes in the mirror. I am. And what about us? What about our marriage? I turned to face him directly. Our marriage isn't going anywhere. Daniel, it's right here, waiting for you to see me, really see me, for the first time in years. His jaw tightened. I see you just fine. I see. No, I said gently. You see what I do for you. That's not the same thing. I left before he could respond, before he could pull me back into the circular argument we'd been having all week. In the car, driving toward downtown and the sleek office, building where Meridian Strategic was located, I felt a strange mixture of nervousness and exhilaration. The stakes felt impossibly high, not just for this interview, but for the new life I was cautiously constructing. Meredith met me in the EI lobby, her professional smile warming as she took in my appearance. You look amazing, she said, giving me a quick hug. Confident. Ready. I am, I replied, surprised to find it was true. The skills I had honed in the corporate world had never really disappeared. They had simply been redirected to managing Daniel's life and career. Now they were mine again, to use for my own advancement. The interview with Catherine, a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s with an intimidating reputation in the industry, was rigorous but invigorating. She probed my experience, challenged my strategies, tested my knowledge of current market trends. For 90 minutes, I existed in a world where my value was measured by my intelligence and insight, not by how well I supported someone else's ambitions. "You've been out of the industry for 6 years," Catherine noted, reviewing my resume. "That's a significant gap." "It is," I agreed. "But I've been applying those same skills in different contexts, managing complex social events, coordinating multiple stakeholders, developing strategic approaches to community engagement. The tools are the same, even if the applications have been different." She studied me for a long moment, then nodded. "Fair point. And honestly, your fresh perspective might be valuable. We tend to get stuck in our ways in this industry." By the time I left the building, the sun was high in a cloudless sky, and my phone displayed 7 missed calls from Daniel. I ignored them, stopping instead at a small cafe where Meredith and I had often lunched in what felt like another lifetime. "How do you think it went?" the barista asked as she handed me my latte. "I think it went well," I replied, surprising myself with the genuine smile that came so easily now. "Really well." As I sipped my coffee, I scrolled through the text messages that had accumulated throughout the morning. Daniel's progression from irritation to panic was clearly visible. 15 a.m. "Where did you put my blue tie, the one I need for the Peterson presentation?" 30 a.m. "Rebecca, I need you to call Collins and reschedule. The presentation is going to run long." 10:45 a.m. "Are you seriously ignoring me right now? This is childish." 20 a.m. "The presentation was a disaster. Peterson had questions I wasn't prepared for. Questions you usually anticipate. This could cost me the promotion." 5 p.m. "Fine, I'll handle it myself. Like I apparently have to handle everything now." 12:40 p.m. "At least tell me when you'll be home. We need to talk about this situation." The final message had come just 15 minutes ago. 30 p.m. "I just got called into Roger's office. Something about the Westfield account. This could be bad, Rebecca. I need you to come home. We need to figure this out together." 6 years ago, even 1 week ago, that last message would have sent me racing home, ready to help Daniel strategize, to smooth over whatever professional rough patch he was encountering. Today, I set my phone down and ordered a sandwich, giving myself permission to enjoy this moment of personal triumph before facing whatever crisis Daniel was navigating. I was no longer his safety net, no longer the invisible force holding his world together. And while part of me felt a twinge of sympathy for his current struggles, a stronger part recognized this as necessary. For both of us. Daniel needed to see what life was like without my constant support, and I needed to remember who I was beyond being his wife. My phone buzzed with an incoming call. Meredith, not Daniel. "Catherine was impressed," she said without preamble. "She wants you to come in next week for a second round, panel interview with the team you'd be working with." "That's wonderful," I replied, genuine excitement warming my voice. "Thank you for recommending me." "Don't thank me yet. The job's not yours. You've got competition. But Catherine specifically mentioned your unique perspective as a strength. I think you've got a real shot." After we hung up, I sat in the cafe a while longer, watching people hurry past the windows, each absorbed in their own lives, their own pursuits. For so long, my world had narrowed to the dimensions of Daniel's needs and ambitions. Now it was expanding again, opening to possibilities I had almost forgotten existed. When I finally drove home, it was mid-afternoon. Daniel's car was in the driveway, unusual for a weekday at this hour. Inside, I found him sitting at the dining room table, surrounded by papers, his expression a mixture of frustration and something approaching fear. He looked up as I entered. his relief at seeing me quickly replaced by resentment. "Nice of you to show up," he said, his voice tight. "While you were out playing career woman, my entire professional life was falling apart." While you were out playing career woman, my entire professional life was falling apart. Daniel's words hung in the air between us, heavy with accusation. I set my purse down on the counter, taking in the scene. Papers scattered across the dining table, his laptop open to what appeared to be a spreadsheet filled with red figures, his hair disheveled from repeatedly running his hands through it. "What happened?" I asked, my voice neutral. Not rushing to his side, not immediately assuming his problems were mine to solve, but not dismissive either. What happened is that the Westfield account is in jeopardy because someone, meaning me apparently, missed a critical deadline last week. He shuffled through papers frantically. There was supposed to be a follow-up proposal after the initial meeting. I thought Allison was handling it, but she said it was on my calendar to review before submission. I watched as he searched through the chaos on the table. Once, I would have immediately stepped in, located the necessary documents, called. The right people smoothed everything over. Now I simply stood, observing his struggle with a strange detachment. "And was it? On your calendar?" I asked. He looked up, frustration etched across his features. "Probably." "I don't know, Rebecca. You're the one who always kept track of these things. Your assistant couldn't help?" "Allison is useless." He stopped abruptly, the word hanging awkwardly between us. A flush crept up his neck. "She's new. She doesn't understand how everything works yet." "I see." I moved to the kitchen, filling the electric kettle. "And the presentation this morning?" Daniel exhaled heavily. "A disaster. Peterson had questions about market projections that weren't in my notes. Questions that you would have anticipated and prepared me for." He pushed away from the table, standing to face me. "This isn't a coincidence, Rebecca. Everything started falling apart the moment you decided to check out of our marriage." I measured tea leaves into the infuser, my movements deliberate. "I haven't checked out of our marriage, Daniel. I've checked out of being your unpaid assistant." "Is that what you think you were? My assistant?" His voice rose slightly. "It's what you treated me as." I met his gaze steadily. "An assistant whose contributions were so insignificant that you could laugh about how useless I was to your friends." He ran both hands through his hair, a gesture that once would have tugged at my heart. Poor Daniel, so stressed, needing my support. Now I saw it for what it was, a practiced move, part of the repertoire he used to manipulate sympathy. I've apologized for that a dozen times. It was a stupid comment that didn't mean anything. "It meant everything," I corrected him. "It was the truth you never intended me to hear." The kettle clicked off. I poured hot water over the tea leaves, watching as the color slowly infused the clear liquid. A perfect metaphor for what was happening between us. Clarity spreading where there had once been only transparency. "So this is revenge," Daniel said flatly. "Sabotaging my career to make me pay for one thoughtless remark." I stirred my tea gently. "This isn't revenge, Daniel. This is consequence. For the first time in our marriage, you're experiencing the reality of what happens when I don't dedicate my entire existence to anticipating and fulfilling your needs. And you're enjoying it," he accused. "You're enjoying watching me struggle." I considered his words carefully before responding. "I'm not enjoying your pain, but I am finding value in my own growth. Those aren't the same thing." He stared at me, as if seeing a stranger. In many ways, he was. The woman standing before him, calmly sipping tea while his professional world teetered on the edge, was not the same person he had married, the eager-to-please young wife who had so willingly subsumed her identity into his. "I need your help," he finally said, his voice lower, almost humble. "Just with this Westfield situation. After that, we can talk about all of this." about making changes. But right now, I'm asking for your help. It was the closest thing to genuine need he had expressed in years. Not demand, not expectation, but acknowledgement that he truly required my specific skills and knowledge. I set my cup down. What exactly do you need? Relief washed over his face. The proposal needs to be completely redone by tomorrow morning. I have all the data, but I need help organizing it, framing the narrative, anticipating objections. All things I excelled at. All things he had taken for granted until they were withdrawn. All right, I said after a moment. I'll help you with this, but not because it's my duty as your wife, because I'm choosing to. The distinction was important to both of us. For the next several hours, we worked side by side in a way we hadn't in years. Not as husband and wife, not as superior and subordinate, but as two professionals combining their skills toward a common goal. I organized his scattered notes, identified the key selling points, crafted compelling responses to potential objections. Daniel, to his credit, listened when I spoke, incorporated my suggestions without resistance, acknowledged my expertise in areas where he struggled. It was, in its own way, the most honest interaction we'd had since our early dating days, before the power dynamics of our marriage had calcified into their dysfunctional pattern. By midnight, the proposal was complete, stronger than anything. Daniel could have produced alone. He saved the document, closing his laptop with a soft click. "Thank you," he said, the words uncharacteristically genuine. "This is exactly what was needed." I nodded, gathering my empty teacup and his coffee mug. "You're welcome." He followed me into the kitchen, watching as I rinsed the cups and placed them in the dishwasher. "We made a good team tonight," he offered, his tone tentative. "Like old times." "No," I corrected him gently. "Not like old times. In the old times, I would have dropped everything at the first sign of your distress. I would have worked through the night while you slept, ensuring everything was perfect by morning. I would have canceled my own plans without hesitation because your career always took priority." His expression fell slightly. "And that was wrong?" "It was unbalanced," I said. "Tonight we worked together as equals. That's the difference. Is that what you want? For us to be equals?" There was genuine confusion in his question, as if the concept had never occurred to him. "Yes, Daniel, that's what I've always wanted. To be seen as your equal, not your accessory." He leaned against the counter, studying me with new eyes. "And the job interview? Is that part of this equality?" "It is." I held his gaze. "I had a second interview next week, a panel interview with the team I'd be working with. And if you get it, then I'll have a career again, my own career, not just a supporting role in yours." He nodded slowly, processing this shift in our reality. "I see." "Do you?" I asked, not unkindly. "Because this isn't temporary, Daniel. It's not a phase that will pass once you've apologized. Enough or once I've made my point. This is who I am now, who I'm becoming." He didn't answer immediately, perhaps for the first time truly considering the permanence of the change between us. Finally, he nodded again, more decisively. "I understand, and I'll try to adjust." It wasn't a full acceptance, not yet. But it was a beginning, a recognition that the old patterns were broken beyond repair, and whatever emerged from this transformation would have to be something entirely new. The days that followed established a different rhythm between us. Daniel began handling more of his own professional responsibilities, though not without struggle. I focused on preparing for my second interview, spending hours researching Meridian's recent projects, analyzing their market position, developing ideas I could bring to the table. We moved around each other with a new awareness, not the comfortable intimacy of before, but not the cold distance of those first revelations either. It was, in many ways, Like getting to know a stranger who happened to share your living space. Awkward, certainly, but also illuminating. I discovered that Daniel could, when necessary, manage his own schedule and handle his own domestic responsibilities. He learned that I had skills and insights that extended far beyond supporting his career. We were both stumbling toward a new understanding of who we were, both together and apart. The night before my panel interview, Daniel surprised me by cooking dinner, a simple pasta dish, nothing elaborate, but a gesture that would have been unthinkable a month ago. "I wanted to wish you luck," he said as he set the plate before me. "For tomorrow." "Thank you," I replied, genuinely touched by the effort. We ate in companionable silence for a while before he spoke again. "I've been thinking about what you said, about being equals." He set his fork down, meeting my gaze directly. I didn't realize how unequal things had become, how much I'd come to depend on you managing everything, how much I took for granted. It was the closest thing to genuine insight he had expressed since this all began. "That night at the restaurant," he continued, "when I said those things about you, it wasn't just thoughtless. It was a reflection of how I'd come to view our marriage. And that's on me, not you." I nodded, acknowledging his words without immediately absolving him. "Yes, it is. I don't know if I can change overnight," he admitted. 6 years of habits don't disappear just because I recognize they're wrong. But I want to try. I want us to find a way forward that works for both of us. That's all I've ever wanted," I said softly. "For both of us to have space to grow, to contribute, to be valued for who we are." He reached across the table, not quite, touching my hand but close enough to signal connection. "Even if you get this job? Even if things change completely?" "Especially then," I replied. "A marriage shouldn't require one person to shrink so the other can expand." Daniel nodded slowly, a hint of sadness in his eyes. I wish I had understood that sooner. Before it took all of this for me to see it. We cleared the dishes together, another small shift in our domestic pattern. As we prepared for bed, moving around each other with the careful politeness of recent weeks, I felt a sense of cautious hope. Not that we would return to what we had been, that was impossible and frankly undesirable, but that we might forge something new, something balanced on the foundation of mutual respect rather than assumed servitude. The next morning, as I prepared for my interview, Daniel wished me luck with apparent sincerity before heading to his own office. Something had shifted between us. Not healed, not resolved, but shifted. The power dynamic that had defined our marriage for so long was being renegotiated, painfully, but perhaps necessarily. Whether our relationship would survive this transformation remained to be seen. But one thing was certain: I would never again allow myself to be dismissed as useless by anyone, least of all by the man who had promised to love and honor me. The Meridian Strategic offices buzzed with energy as I waited in the sleek conference room for my panel interview. Through the glass walls, I could see professionals hurrying past, engaged in conversations, moving with purpose. This world, the corporate landscape I had once navigated with confidence, felt both familiar and new, like returning to a hometown. After years away, Meredith poked her head in, offering an encouraging smile. "They're just wrapping up a client call. 2 minutes." I nodded, smoothing my skirt and taking a deep breath. 6 years ago, I had excelled in environments like this. Before Daniel, before I had slowly surrendered pieces of my identity to become what he needed me to be. The door opened, and Catherine entered, followed by 3 other executives, 2 men and a woman, all carrying tablets and regarding me with professional curiosity. "Rebecca," Catherine said, extending her hand, "thank you for coming back. We were impressed with your initial interview and wanted to dig deeper into how you might fit with our team. The next 90 minutes were exhilarating, challenging questions about strategy, scenarios requiring quick analysis, discussions about emerging market trends. I felt my mind expanding, stretching to meet each intellectual challenge. This wasn't about being perfect or agreeable. It was about demonstrating value through insight and expertise. Your perspective on the Harrington campaign is interesting, said Michael, the marketing director. Most candidates suggest conventional approaches, but your idea of targeting micro-influencers in niche markets shows real strategic thinking. Sometimes the most effective solutions come from looking beyond established patterns, I replied. In my experience, innovation often happens at the edges, not the center. As I spoke, I realized I was drawing not just on my formal education and previous work experience, but also on skills I'd developed during my years with Daniel: reading people, anticipating needs, navigating complex social dynamics. Those abilities, honed in the service of his career, were valuable assets in their own right. By the time the interview concluded, I felt a confidence I hadn't experienced in years. Regardless of the outcome, I had proven to myself that I wasn't defined by my role as Daniel's wife, that I had worth beyond the domestic sphere I'd been relegated to. We'll be in touch very soon, Catherine said as she walked me out. But I have to say, Rebecca, you've made quite an impression. Not many candidates with a 6-year gap jump back in with such clarity. I smiled, recognizing the genuine respect in her tone. Sometimes stepping away gives you perspective you couldn't gain otherwise. As I drove home, my phone buzzed with a text from Daniel. How did it go? The simple question carried weight. Not, when will you be home? Or, can you pick up dinner? Just genuine interest in my experience. A small shift, but significant. I think it went well, I replied. Should hear something soon. 3 dots appeared, disappeared, then reappeared. Proud of you. 2 words that would have once meant everything to me. Validation from the man whose approval I had desperately sought. Now they registered as pleasant, but not essential. My sense of worth no longer hinged on Daniel's assessment. When I arrived home, I found Daniel in the kitchen, attempting to prepare dinner. The counter was scattered with chopped vegetables in various states, a cookbook propped open beside a pan of what appeared to be burning garlic. You're cooking? I asked, setting down my purse. He looked up, slightly frazzled. Trying to. I wanted to celebrate your interview, but it's not exactly. He gestured helplessly at the smoking pan. I couldn't help but smile. This man who confidently navigated corporate boardrooms, who closed million-dollar deals without breaking a sweat, was completely undone by a simple recipe. Here, I said, moving beside him and lowering the heat. Let me help. We worked together, his movements uncertain, mine practiced. It was a reversal of our usual dynamic, me guiding, him following. As we assembled the stir-fry, I found myself wondering if this was what true partnership felt like, each contributing their strengths, supporting the other's growth, no one diminished in the process. Over dinner, Daniel asked about the interview, not out of obligation, but with apparent interest. I shared the experience, the challenging questions, the energy of being in a professional environment again. You sound different, he observed, studying me across the table. More animated, more yourself. I feel more myself, I admitted. Being in that room, engaging with those ideas, it reminded me of who I was before. An awkward silence fell between us. Before him, before us. Before I had gradually surrendered my professional identity to become Daniel's wife. I never asked you to give up your career, he said quietly. No, I agreed. You never asked. You just created conditions where maintaining it became impossible, he frowned. What do you mean? The relocation for your promotion. The expectation that I would handle all domestic responsibilities. the social obligations that always took priority over my professional opportunities. I kept my tone even, not accusatory, but matter of fact. None of it was explicit, Daniel. It was just assumed. He was silent for a long moment, processing. I didn't see it that way, he finally said. I thought we were making decisions together, that we agreed my career had more potential. Did we discuss it? Really discuss it? Or did you present your career moves as inevitable and my adjustments as natural consequences? Daniel set down his fork, genuinely considering the question. I don't know. It all seemed so obvious at the time. My salary was higher, my trajectory clearer. And my career became a hobby. I finished for him. Something I could play at while supporting your real work. Understanding dawned in his eyes. Like when I told my colleagues you were useless. Exactly like that. He pushed his plate away slightly. I'm sorry, Rebecca. Not just for saying it, but for thinking it. For not seeing how much I was taking from you while convincing myself I was giving. It was the most genuine apology he had offered. Not defensive. Not conditional, but a real acknowledgement of the harm done. Thank you, I said simply. Later that evening, as we moved around each other in the familiar routine of preparing for bed, Daniel paused by the dresser, a strange expression crossing his face. I got a call from Simpson today, he said, mentioning a colleague at a competing firm. He offered me a position, better salary, bigger team. That's impressive, I replied, waiting for the familiar expectation that I would immediately begin planning our lives around this new opportunity, researching neighborhoods, preparing to uproot whatever I had built to accommodate his advancement. It would mean moving to Chicago, he continued, starting over there. I said nothing, letting the silence expand between us. This was a test, for both of us. The old pattern hovered, ready to reassert itself. The old Rebecca would have immediately begun calculating what she would need to sacrifice to make this work for him. I told him I needed to discuss it with you, Daniel finally said. That any decision would be made together, considering both our careers. The words hung in the air between us, an acknowledgement of the new reality we were negotiating. Not a full transformation, not yet, but a recognition that the old dynamics could not continue. Thank you, I said softly. He nodded, and we continued our bedtime routine in thoughtful silence. As I lay beside him in the darkness, I realized we were standing at a crossroads. The path forward wasn't clear, wasn't guaranteed, but for the first time in years, I felt like an active participant in charting our course rather than a passenger on Daniel's journey. The next morning, my phone rang just as I was finishing breakfast. Catherine's name flashed on the screen. Rebecca, she said when I answered. I'll get straight to the point. We'd like to offer you the position of strategic consultant with Meridian. My heart raced as she outlined the details. The salary, higher than I had expected. The benefits. The start date 3 weeks away. This wasn't just a job. It was a reclamation of the professional identity I had surrendered. I'd like to accept, I said, my voice steady despite the emotion welling inside me. Excellent. We'll send the formal offer letter today. Welcome to Meridian, Rebecca. After the call ended, I sat at the kitchen table, absorbing the magnitude of the moment. For so long, my days had been structured around Daniel's needs, my identity defined by my relationship to him. Now I was stepping back into my own story. Daniel appeared in the doorway, already dressed for work, catching the expression on my face. Good news? He asked. I got the job, I said simply. A series of emotions flickered across his features. Surprise, uncertainty, and something that might have been pride. Congratulations, he said, his tone genuine if complicated. That's wonderful. Thank you. He hesitated in the doorway. What does this mean for us? For our marriage? It was the question that had been hovering unspoken between us since the night I'd overheard his cruel assessment of my worth. What did all of this mean for us? Could a relationship built on such uneven ground be reconstructed into something balanced, something true? I don't know, I answered honestly. It means change. It means negotiation. It means seeing each other as equals, not as supporter and supported. And if I can't do that? His voice was quiet, vulnerable in a way Daniel rarely allowed himself to be. Then we'll have to make difficult decisions, I replied, because I won't go back to being invisible, to being the person whose contributions are so overlooked they can be dismissed as worthless. He nodded slowly, absorbing the finality in my tone. I understand. For a moment, we simply looked at each other. Two people who had shared a life but perhaps never truly seen one another until now. The future stretched before us, uncertain but vivid with possibility. I have a dinner meeting tonight, Daniel said, with the Chicago firm. I'd like you to come with me, not as my wife, but as my partner, to ask your own questions, to consider what moving might mean for your career too, to help me decide if this is right for us, not just for me. It was a small gesture, but meaningful, an invitation to equal participation in a decision that would affect both our lives. I'd like that, I replied. As he left for work, I remained at the kitchen table, contemplating the subtle but profound shift occurring between us. Whether our marriage would survive this transformation remained uncertain, but one thing was clear. I had reclaimed something precious in these weeks of quiet revolution: my sense of self, my recognition of my own value, my place in the world as more than an extension of someone else. The woman who had stood frozen in that restaurant hallway, devastated by her husband's casual cruelty, was gone. In her place stood someone stronger, someone who understood that true worth is never dependent on another's assessment, and that sometimes the most powerful response to being called useless is simply to stop being useful. The restaurant Daniel had chosen for the dinner meeting was exactly the type of establishment he favored. Dim lighting, hushed conversations, waiters who materialized and disappeared with practiced discretion. The kind of place where important men made important decisions over rare steaks and expensive bourbon. In the past, I would have dressed specifically to compliment Daniel, choosing colors he preferred, styles that presented the image of the successful executive's wife. Tonight, I wore a sleek navy pantsuit that I had purchased for my interview, an outfit chosen for my own confidence rather than his approval. James Simpson, the executive from Chicago, stood as we approached the table, his appraising gaze moving between us. Daniel, good to see you again. And this must be Rebecca. Yes, Daniel said, his hand resting lightly on my lower back. My wife, Rebecca Lawson. The subtle emphasis on my last name, not introduced as simply Rebecca or my wife, was a small but noticeable shift, a recognition of my separate identity. Rebecca is a strategic marketing consultant, Daniel added as we took our seats. She just accepted a position with Meridian Strategic here in Boston. Simpson's eyebrows rose slightly. Impressive firm. Congratulations. Thank you, I replied, meeting his gaze directly. As the evening progressed, I observed the dynamics with new awareness. Simpson directed most of his conversation toward Daniel, the default pattern in these professional social hybrid situations, but Daniel repeatedly brought me into the discussion. Rebecca has some expertise in that market sector, he would say. Or what do you think about that approach, Rebecca? These weren't the practiced gestures of a man showcasing his wife's acceptable opinions. They were genuine inclusions, acknowledgments of my professional perspective. The distinction was subtle, but profound. When Simpson outlined the position he was offering Daniel, a senior vice presidency with significant responsibility and compensation, I watched my husband's response carefully. The old Daniel would have been entirely focused on the prestige, the title, the external validation. This Daniel seemed more measured, more thoughtful. "The role sounds impressive," Daniel said. "But I'm curious about the company culture. Your turnover rate in senior management has been higher than industry average for the past 2 years." Simpson shifted slightly, clearly not expecting this line of questioning. "We've been in a transitional period. Restructuring always creates some movement." "And the expectation of regular travel to the Asian markets?" Daniel continued. "That would be a significant commitment. About 1 week per month," Simpson confirmed, "standard for positions at this level." I watched as Daniel absorbed this information, noticing the slight furrow between his brows. 6 months ago, he would have accepted these demands without question. His career always took priority, and any sacrifices required, primarily from me, were considered inevitable. "That's a considerable time away from home," Daniel said, glancing at me. "Something we'd need to discuss together." The "we" hung in the air, a declaration of partnership I hadn't heard from him in years. As the dinner continued, I participated actively in the conversation, asking pointed questions about the Wu company's market position, their strategic direction, the team Daniel would be leading. Simpson answered professionally, but with growing awareness that he was being evaluated by both of us, not just by his primary recruitment target. By the time dessert arrived, the dynamic had shifted subtly. This was no longer simply a wooing of Daniel by a competing firm. It was a mutual assessment of whether this opportunity would serve both our professional aspirations. On the drive home, silence stretched between us, but it wasn't the tense quiet of recent weeks. It was thoughtful, contemplative. "He wants an answer by next Friday," Daniel finally said, eyes on the road ahead. "What are you thinking?" I asked. He exhaled slowly. 6 months ago, I would have accepted immediately. The title, the salary, the prestige, it ticks all the boxes I thought mattered. And now?" He glanced at me briefly before returning his attention to the road. "Now I'm wondering about the cost. A week per month in Asia, regular late nights, a complete restart in a new city." He paused. "And what it would mean for your new position, just as you're rebuilding your career." The acknowledgement that my professional life carried weight in our decisions was startling in its novelty. "I appreciate that," I said quietly. "I meant what I said, Rebecca. Any decision needs to work for both of us, not just for me, with you adjusting around the edges." When we arrived home, instead of immediately retreating to separate activities as had become our habit, we sat together at the kitchen table, 2 legal pads between us, listing pros and cons of the Chicago opportunity versus staying in Boston. "If we stay," Daniel said, writing on his pad, "you can build your position at Meridian without disruption. I can continue at Grayson, though after the Westfield situation, my path to VP might be delayed. And if we go to Chicago," I continued, "you get an immediate promotion with higher visibility. I would need to start my job search over, potentially facing another gap in my resume." He nodded, adding to his list. "Chicago would mean leaving our support network. New doctors, new service providers, new everything. But potentially a fresh start for us," I countered. "A chance to establish new patterns without the weight of old habits." Daniel looked up, meeting my gaze. "Is that what you want? A fresh start?" The question carried layers of meaning beyond the geographic decision. Was I looking for a fresh start in our marriage? Or was I simply marking time until I was established enough to leave? "I want a life where both of us can thrive," I said carefully. "Where neither of us feels diminished by the other's success. Do you think that's possible for us? After everything?" It was the question that had been hovering unspoken between us since the night at the Ivory Room. Could a relationship built on such an uneven foundation be reconstructed into something balanced? "I don't know," I answered honestly. "But I'm willing to try if you are. Really try, not just make temporary adjustments until things slide back to what's comfortable. Daniel set down his pen, reaching across the table to take my hand. It was the first deliberate touch between us in weeks that wasn't incidental or perfunctory. "I want to try," he said, his voice low and sincere. "I've been doing a lot of thinking about what you said, about how I created conditions that made your career impossible without ever explicitly asking you to give it up, about how I benefited from your support without acknowledging its value." He squeezed my hand gently. "I don't want to be that person anymore. And I don't want to be the person who surrenders herself so completely that she becomes invisible," I replied, "even to herself." We sat in silence for a moment, hands connected across the table, the weight of 6 years of patterns between us. Not all bad, not all good, but all in need of examination. "What if we postponed the decision?" Daniel suggested. "Told Simpson, I need more time. Let you settle into your new role at Meridian. See if we can find our footing here before making any major changes." It was a reasonable proposal, thoughtful, measured, considering multiple factors rather than just his immediate career advancement. The kind of approach that acknowledged complexity rather than bulldozing through it. "I think that makes sense." I agreed. He nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Look at us, making a mutual decision like actual partners." "Revolutionary," I replied, returning his smile. That night, as we prepared for bed, the careful distance that had characterized our interactions in recent weeks softened slightly. Not a return to how things had been. That was impossible and undesirable, but perhaps the beginning of something new, something built on clearer seeing. "I start at Meridian in 3 weeks, I said as I set my alarm. "Orientation is Monday the 15th. "We should celebrate," Daniel suggested. "Maybe dinner that weekend? Your choice of restaurant." "I'd like that." He hesitated, then added, "I'm proud of you, Rebecca. Not in a patronizing way, but genuinely impressed by how you've reclaimed your professional identity so quickly. It takes courage to step back into a field after 6 years away." The compliment, offered without expectation of reciprocation, without subtle undermining, felt genuine in a way his praise rarely had before. "Thank you," I said simply. As the days passed, we established new patterns, not perfect, not always smooth, but more conscious than before. Daniel took on more household responsibilities without prompting. I maintained my independence while still engaging as a partner. We were learning, awkwardly but sincerely, how to exist as two whole people rather than as provider and supporter. The weekend before my start date at Meridian, Daniel suggested brunch at a cafe downtown. "To mark the occasion," he said, "your official return to the professional world." The cafe was bustling, sunlight streaming through large windows, conversations, and the clinking of cutlery creating a pleasant backdrop. As we settled at our table, I noticed a familiar group at the far end of the room, Daniel's colleagues, including several who had been at the Ivory Room that night. Daniel followed my gaze, his expression tightening slightly. "We can leave if you'd prefer?" "No," I said, straightening my shoulders. "It's fine." Richard Collins, Daniel's boss and the man who had laughed the loudest at his useless wife comment, spotted us and approached our table, his wife trailing behind him. "Daniel, Rebecca, what a pleasant surprise." His smile was broad, professionally charming. "Enjoying a weekend brunch?" "We're celebrating, actually," Daniel replied, his hand finding mine on the table. "Rebecca has accepted a strategic consultant position at Meridian. She starts next week." The shift in Collins's expression was subtle but unmistakable. Surprise, reassessment, a quick recalibration of his understanding of our dynamic. "Meridian? Impressive firm," he said, turning to me with new interest. "Congratulations." "Thank you," I replied, my smile pleasant but not eager. "I'm looking forward to the challenge." "Rebecca was in marketing before we married," Daniel continued, his thumb running lightly over my knuckles. "She's brilliant at strategic positioning. Meridian's lucky to have her." The pride in his voice was genuine, not the performative admiration he might once have displayed in front of his colleagues, but real appreciation for my abilities. Colin's wife looked between us, her expression curious, perhaps detecting the shift in our dynamic. "We should have you both over for dinner soon," Colin suggested, though his tone lacked its usual commanding certainty. "Catch up properly." "We'll check our schedules," I replied smoothly. "Things are quite busy with the new position." After they moved on, Daniel let out a soft laugh. Collins looked like he was encountering an entirely different person than he expected. "He was," I said simply. Daniel's smile softened as he looked at me across the table. We both were. In that moment, sitting in the sunlit cafe, I recognized a fundamental truth. The transformation of the past weeks wasn't just about my independence or Daniel's awakening. It was about both of us seeing each other and ourselves clearly for perhaps the first time since our relationship began. Whether this new vision would sustain us remained uncertain. Old patterns have a way of reasserting themselves. Real change requires constant vigilance. But as Daniel raised his coffee cup in a small toast to my new beginning, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: cautious hope. Not for a return to what had been, but for the possibility of what might be. A relationship between equals, each valued for their whole self, neither diminished to enhance the other. "To new beginnings," Daniel said softly. "To being seen," I replied, touching my cup to his. 6 months later, I stood in front of the mirror adjusting my blazer before heading to work. The woman reflected back at me was barely recognizable from the one who had stood frozen in the Ivory Room half a year ago, devastated by her husband's casual cruelty. My position at Meridian had evolved quickly. The strategic campaign I'd developed for their largest client had exceeded projections, earning me recognition throughout the firm. Daniel had declined the Chicago offer, choosing instead to rebuild his position at Grayson. It hadn't been easy for him. His professional stumbles had cost him some standing, but he was slowly regaining ground on more honest terms. Our marriage had transformed too. Not into some perfect fairy tale, but into something more authentic than what had existed before. We had learned to navigate conflict without reverting to old patterns, to respect each other's professional commitments, to share responsibilities rather than default to gendered expectations. There were still difficult moments. Sometimes Daniel slipped into old habits, expecting me to handle tasks that had once been mine without discussion. Sometimes I found myself automatically prioritizing his needs over my own, the muscle memory of 6 years not easily unlearned. But the difference now was our awareness. We caught ourselves, corrected course, discussed the lapses rather than letting resentment build beneath the surface. "Ready for your presentation?" Daniel asked, appearing in the doorway of our bedroom, 2 travel mugs of coffee in hand. "As ready as I'll ever be," I replied, accepting the coffee he offered. A small gesture of support from a man who had once expected to be constantly supported without reciprocation. "You're going to be brilliant," he said, his confidence in me genuine rather than perfunctory. "The Westfield approach you developed is exactly what they need." I smiled at the irony. Westfield, the account that had begun to unravel for Daniel, when I stopped managing his life, was now a client I was presenting to independently. Life had a way of coming full circle. As we walked out to our separate cars, another change in our routine, each of us responsible for our own professional journeys, Daniel paused beside me. "I'm glad you didn't give up on us," he said quietly. "When you heard what I said that night, you could have just left." "Sometimes leaving isn't the bravest choice," I replied. "Sometimes staying and demanding better is." He nodded, understanding the implicit challenge in my words. Our marriage survived not because I had forgiven and forgotten, but because he had risen to meet my demand for respect, for recognition, for equal partnership. As I drove to my meeting, I reflected on the strange path that had brought me here. How sometimes it takes a moment of devastating clarity to break patterns that have slowly imprisoned you. How standing up for your worth may mean temporarily withdrawing the very things that others have taken for granted. Daniel had called me useless, believing I would break, believing I would beg for his approval. Instead, I had shown him exactly how useless I could be when I stopped caring, stopped trying, stopped being his safety net. And when he fell, when his carefully constructed world began to crumble, he discovered something unexpected. That real partnership was stronger than dependency, that respecting my worth increased rather than diminished his own. Some might call it revenge, this quiet revolution I had enacted. But it wasn't about hurting Daniel. It was about healing myself, about reclaiming the woman who had slowly disappeared. Beneath the weight of unacknowledged sacrifice, that woman was back now, stronger, clearer, unafraid to be seen.